All right. So this week, um, you guys sent over a really comprehensive FAQ about discrete hookups, specifically for men.
Hmm.
And, it's one of those things that kind of right away I was like, oh, wow, this is really interesting because, there's a lot of different reasons
Yeah.
why someone might want to, be discreet about this area of their life.
Absolutely.
Maybe they're married, maybe they're just not out, maybe they just value their privacy, and that's totally, a legitimate thing.
Right.
But, regardless of what the reason is, it
Yeah.
seems like there's definitely a need for good, clear information.
Yes, absolutely.
Hmm.
And this FAQ that you sent over from menmeetmen.com, it really is it's pretty remarkable
Yeah.
in just how direct and practical it is.
Hmm.
It doesn't get into any sort of moralizing or judgment.
Right.
It really just focuses on, okay, you want to do this, here's how to do it.
Right.
And it really does cover a wide spectrum.
Yeah.
Everything from the logistics of actually meeting people
Right.
to, some of the anxieties that someone might have around this topic.
Yeah. And that's exactly what we're going to do today.
Right.
We're going to, kind of take this FAQ as our jumping off point and really dig into some of the big questions
Mhm.
and hopefully give you guys listening, some clarity and some information on this so
Right,
that
yeah.
you feel, empowered and informed.
Great.
So let's just dive right in.
Okay.
The first question, of course, that always comes up is how do you actually go about meeting other men discreetly?
Right. Well, the FAQ kind of lays out a few different paths,
Okay.
each with its own kind of considerations. The first one they talk about is hookup apps,
Mm-hmm.
specifically apps that have really robust privacy features built into them.
Okay.
They mention a few examples like Field and Anna for Adam and Timey,
Right.
but really what they're getting at is that
Mhm.
you can use the technology to your advantage
Yeah.
if you are concerned about privacy.
Right. It's not just about, swiping left and right. It's about
Mhm.
being strategic about how you use the tools that are available to you.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's hookup apps, and they talk about private venues.
Hmm.
So what do they mean by that?
So they're talking about things like gay saunas or swingers clubs that are open to bisexual individuals.
Okay.
And what's interesting about these places is that there's often a kind of built-in understanding of discretion.
Right.
Like the people who go there are already kind of on the same page about wanting to keep things private.
Yeah, it's like there's almost like an unspoken social contract.
Exactly. There's a shared mindset.
Yeah.
So the discretion isn't just about the physical space itself, but it's also about the community.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, and then the third option they mentioned is low-key cruising locations.
Right.
So for someone who's not familiar with that term, what exactly does that mean?
Well, essentially it means public or semi-public spaces where men might go to meet other men discreetly.
Okay.
This could be anything from certain parks or rest stops
Mm-hmm.
to specific areas within, a city. But the FAQ does caution that you have to approach these situations carefully
Yeah.
because unlike an app or a private venue,
Mm-hmm.
cruising can be a lot more unpredictable
Right.
and the level of privacy can really vary.
So it really depends on the specific location and the context.
It does. And it also, for you, the listener, really comes down to how comfortable you are with a certain level of risk.
Right.
Some people are going to be fine with that level of uncertainty. Other people can be like, no way, that's too much for me.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got this spectrum of options.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, a question that's probably on a lot of people's minds is, do I have to be out
Right.
to do this discreetly?
Yeah, that's a really common concern. And the FAQ addresses it very directly.
Okay.
They say, no, you absolutely do not have to be out
Okay.
to explore these connections discreetly.
Okay.
They actually point out that a lot of men choose to explore this part of their lives privately,
Mm-hmm.
and that's perfectly valid.
Yeah.
The key distinction they make is between discretion and dishonesty.
Okay.
So choosing to keep certain aspects of your life private
Right.
is not the same as lying to people.
Yeah.
It's about controlling who you share what with and when.
Right. It's about boundaries.
Exactly.
And I think that's so important because it takes the pressure off.
Yeah.
Nobody's saying you have to come out on anyone else's timeline but your own.
Right. It's a personal journey.
It is, and you get to decide how that unfolds.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's say someone decides to use apps.
Okay.
What are some concrete things that they can do
Yeah.
to maintain their anonymity?
Well, the FAQ gives some really practical advice here.
Okay.
The first thing they say is use a new email address,
Okay.
one that's not connected to any of your personal or professional accounts.
Right, so like a burner email, essentially.
Exactly. just for this purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And that creates a layer of separation right away.
Yeah, that makes sense. What else?
They also say don't use photos that clearly show your face, at least not initially,
Mm-hmm.
because obviously that makes it much harder for people to recognize you.
Right. And then they also talk about not linking your social media or your contacts.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Avoid linking any other accounts
Okay.
because that can create a trail back to your real identity.
Right. You might think, oh, it's just convenient. But if
Mhm.
you're really concerned about privacy, you got to think about those connections.
Oh, great.
Okay, what about location services?
Yeah, that's another big one. They recommend either turning off location services altogether
Okay.
while you're using the app, or if the app has the option, blurring your distance
Okay.
so that people can't see exactly where you are.
Gotcha. And then I know some apps also have like incognito modes or private browsing.
They do, yeah. Some apps have those features built in,
Okay.
and those can give you even more control over who sees your profile and your activity.
So it sounds like if you're smart about it,
Yeah.
you can actually maintain a pretty good level of anonymity
You can.
on these apps. Okay, let's talk about meeting offline because,
Mhm.
the FAQ also talks about the safest ways to transition
Right.
from online to in-person.
Yeah, and they give some really good advice here.
Okay.
They basically say you should prioritize venues that have inherent safety measures in place.
What does that mean?
So, for example, places that might ban phone use,
Okay.
which actually also kind of enhances discretion,
Right.
and also places that require ID for entry.
Okay.
They mention things like gay saunas or well-established clubs
Mm-hmm.
as examples because these places tend to have rules and staff
Right.
and just a general level of accountability.
Yeah. It's not just like some random place with no oversight.
Right.
Okay, so that's one thing they recommend. What else?
They also really emphasize the importance of meeting in neutral public locations for those initial encounters.
Right.
So, like, don't go straight to someone's apartment or your own apartment.
Right. Meet in a public place first.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Meet for coffee or a drink.
Yeah. Somewhere where you can assess the situation.
Right. And if you're not feeling it, you can leave.
Exactly.
And they also have a pretty strong warning about avoiding what they call dark alleyway encounters.
Yes, they do.
What do they mean by that?
Well, basically, they're talking about the risks
Yeah.
of meeting someone in an isolated or poorly lit area where there's not a lot of people around. And if something were to happen,
Right.
you might not have any help.
It's just common sense.
It is, yeah.
Okay, let's talk about online profiles for a minute.
Okay.
The FAQ talks about using fake names.
Mm-hmm.
What's their take on that?
So they say that using a nickname or a pseudonym is totally fine.
Okay.
And actually pretty common.
Right.
But what they really emphasize is what you should avoid sharing.
Okay.
So they say don't give out your real full name
Okay.
right away in those initial conversations.
Right.
And definitely don't share things like your work information or your home address
Right.
or specific locations that you frequent. Okay, so it's about being cautious with that kind of personally identifiable information.
It is. And it's also about not feeling like you owe anyone
Yeah.
your whole life story right away.
Right.
You know, the FAQ actually says boundaries are healthy.
Yeah,
You don't owe strangers your life story.
that's such a good point.
Yeah.
It's about controlling how much information you share
It is.
and when.
Right.
Okay, so let's say the discreet hookup has happened.
Okay.
What about discretion after the encounter?
That's important too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because I feel like that's where things can get messy.
They can. The FAQ has some advice for this as well.
Okay.
They say, number one, avoid sharing any details about the hookup on social media.
Yeah, that's a big one.
It is.
Mm.
Even seemingly harmless comments can sometimes reveal more than you intend.
Right. People can put two and two together,
They can.
especially if they know both people involved.
Exactly.
Okay, so no social media. What else?
They also say don't discuss the encounter with any mutual acquaintances.
Right.
Because even if you trust those people, you're
Yeah.
still kind of violating the other person's privacy.
It's not your story to tell.
It's not. And they also say that it's really important to have a conversation about privacy with your partner
Okay.
beforehand.
So, like, set some ground rules.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, talk about who knows what
Right.
and what's okay to share and what's not.
That seems like a really good idea.
It is.
Mhm.
It can prevent a lot of awkwardness and potential drama later on.
Right. And then they end this section with what they call the golden rule,
Mm-hmm.
which is
Never out someone else,
okay.
even accidentally.
Right.
You know, you never know what someone's situation is,
Yeah,
and you don't have the right to expose them.
Absolutely. It's about respecting their privacy.
It is.
Okay, so now let's get a little bit more into the emotional side of things.
Okay.
Because the FAQ actually asks the question, is it normal to feel nervous?
Yeah.
So what do they say about that?
They say, absolutely, it's totally normal to feel nervous,
Okay.
especially if you're new to this or if you're worried about getting caught.
Right.
Those feelings are valid.
Yeah.
It's a natural response to doing something that feels a little bit risky or uncertain.
Right. And so what do they recommend for people who are feeling anxious?
They give some really simple but practical advice.
Okay.
They say, first of all, just breathe,
Okay.
take a deep breath,
Right.
allow yourself to go slowly,
Yeah.
and only do what feels safe and comfortable for you.
So basically listen to your gut.
Exactly. If something feels off, don't do it.
Yeah. And they also make a really important point at the end.
What's that?
They say curiosity does not equal obligation.
Right.
What do they mean by that?
They mean that just because you might be curious
Yeah.
about exploring these kinds of connections doesn't mean you have to act on it.
Right.
You always have the right to say no.
Absolutely. You're in control.
You are.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
what would you say is like the big takeaway?
I think the big takeaway is that discrete hookups are ultimately about control. It's about you being in control of who knows
Yeah,
what happens, and how far things go.
absolutely. And this FAQ gives you the tools and the information
It does.
to be able to do that.
Mm.
So to all of you listening, whether you're already engaging in this or
Right.
you're just thinking about it,
Yeah.
remember to go at your own pace
Mm-hmm.
and prioritize your own safety and comfort above all else.
And on that note, it leaves us with a really interesting question to ponder.
Okay.
As our digital world keeps evolving and our attitudes toward privacy keep shifting,
Mm-hmm.
how do you think all of this is going to play out
Yeah.
in the future of discrete hookups?
It's something to think about.
It is.
All right. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.